So when I asked Jibesh, about what the topic you expected me to address today, he answered, well, you can either revisit your intellectual journey and the question that it opens for us, or you can propose some provocations for fresh thinking about the present. Well, as I have never been very good at making decisions, I shall present you something in between. I'll try to map the modification of the intellectual landscape which I think characterized the last decades, and to explain how my own work is inscribed both inside and against this evolution, and how, hopefully, some suggestions can be drawn from it for rethinking some theoretical and political issues at stake today. The first point in the discussion is how do we determine the transformations the intellectual landscape of our world has gone through since the times of the turbulent 60s. And I'd like to call into question the dominant answer that has been formulated as well known in terms of time. This answer has been encapsulated in a short word, end, and even less than a word, a prefix, post. What we are said to have lived is the end of a certain historical periods. Many things are said to have gone to their end, not only the division of the world between a capitalist bloc and a communist bloc, but also a vision of the world organized by class conflict. Not only class conflict, but politics thought of as a practice of division. Not only a lot of revolutionary hopes, but ideologies in general, or in the most comprehensive formulation, grand narratives and beliefs about the destiny of humankind. Not only a period of history, but history itself understood as a time of a promise leading to its completion. As for the prefix post, it was used to designate not only the time after the end, but the way of being of those who live in this time after the end, those who grapple with it, both interiorizing and denying it, since post means, in fact, two opposite things, not only what comes when a time is over, but also what continues the time that is over, what makes as though it was not over, etc. So, such is the current dominant way of characterizing the evolution that has made the present we are living in. My point is, and it's very simple, this description in terms of end and post is itself a weapon designed to impose a certain view of our time. The statement about the end is part of the conception of history that it claims to dismiss. Statements about the separation of historical periods, and more generally, statements about the partitions of time are statements about the impossible. They say time is over, which means we can no more, which means you can no more, which ends up meaning you cannot at all, you cannot at all, you must not. So the statement about the end ends up formulating a prohibition. I'll go back over the use of time partitions later on. At this moment, I only want to bring up my own statement about the sequence of time designated by the notions of the end and the post. It reads as follows. The discourse about the end, the post, etc. is only a particular phrasing of the configuration of the world prescribed today by the ruling oligarchies. Roughly speaking, it is part of the intellectual counter-revolution, which I think is a proper name for the evolution we have gone through, at least in the Western world, during the last decades. This is my first point. The main trend of this period, I think, is not characterized, as the opinion goes, by the erasing of the old structures, forms of life, and ideologies. The grand narrative of modernity has not been dismissed. Instead, its elements have been recycled to construct a new grand narrative. What happened is not a process of vanishing of struggles and belief, heading towards some sort of leveling of the old oppositions. It's an active attempt at configuring an order of domination able to dismiss any resistance or any alternative by imposing itself as self-evident and inescapable. Now my second point is, this intellectual counter-revolution has found the bulk of its descriptive and argumentative stuff in the recycling of descriptions, narratives, and arguments that were that were formerly associated with critical and revolutionary thinking, and above all, with the Marxist tradition. Of course, we know that the dominant narrative about the contemporary world proclaims the global triumph of world capitalism and global liberal democracy over Marxism. But this narrative has to brush aside at least two puzzling facts. The first one, that will be out of the scope of my talk today, is the fact that one of the leading capitalist powers today is led by a communist party. The second that I wish to address is that the discourse of the intellectual counter-revolution built its hegemony by incorporating descriptions and narratives, arguments and beliefs, borrowed from the critical tradition and from the Marxist discourse in particular. This reversal comprises four major themes that I will examine in order. Those four arguments deal with, first, the economic necessity, second, the process of dematerialization of solid structure, third, the process of commodification of social relations, source, the mechanism of ideological inversion. First point, economic necessity, or more precisely, the equation between economic necessity and historical necessity. Once upon a time, this equation was equated itself with so-called Marxist determinism, to which the mainstream discourse in the Western world opposed the freedom of people freely exchanging their products in the free market. Now, with the interweaving of all markets in the global economy, this freedom is clearly viewed by its champions themselves as the freedom to submit to the necessity of the global market. What was yesterday the necessity of the evolution leading to socialism is rephrased today as a necessity of the evolution leading to the triumph of this global market. Not surprisingly, this displacement has been advocated, in Europe at least, by a lot of formerly Marxist, socialist, or progressive sociologists and economists who turn their faith in the historical achievement of revolution into a faith in the historical achievement of reform. What reform means in the Western world since the times of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher is a reconstruction not only of work relationships, but of all social relationships in accordance with the logic of the free market. So, consequently, all forms of destruction of the welfare state, social security, labor laws, etc., are justified by the necessity of adapting to this inescapable historical evolution. Thereby, all forms of resistance to those attempts are deemed reactionary attitudes of part of the population afraid of the historical evolution, much in the same way as, Marx in the 19th century denounced those artisans, petty bourgeois, and ideologues fighting against the development of capitalist forms, preparing socialism. Well, in France, for instance, when big strikes burst out in 1995 against the conservative government, which set out to reform the system of pensions, most of the left-wing intelligentsia backed the government and lambasted those backward strikers, egoistically sacrificing the future to the short-sighted defense of their privileges. And from this time on, each social movement has more or less been accused by this progressive intelligentsia of egoism and backwardness.